21 April 1926, London, England. The morning appeared ordinary. Across the streets of Mayfair, people hurried to work, newspapers landed on doorsteps, and the city carried on with its usual rhythm. No one walking those streets could have imagined that behind the doors of a townhouse at 17 Bruton Street, history was quietly changing forever. Inside that home, a baby girl was born. Her name was Elizabeth Alexandra Mary. At that very moment, no one celebrated the arrival of a future queen. She was not expected to inherit the throne. She was simply the first child of Prince Albert, Duke of York, and Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. She stood third in the line of succession, behind her uncle, Prince Edward, and her own father. According to every expectation, the crown would never rest upon her head. But history has never followed the plans of men. The child born that spring morning would one day become the longest-reigning monarch in British history, serving for more than 70 years and witnessing some of the greatest events ever recorded. From the Great Depression and the Second World War to the Cold War, the moon landing, the fall of the British Empire, the rise of the Commonwealth, the digital revolution, and the dawn of the 21st century. Yet before the jeweled crowns, state banquets, royal ceremonies, and global recognition, she was simply a little girl affectionately known as Lilibet. The nickname came from her inability to pronounce Elizabeth as a toddler. Her family found it charming, and the name remained with her throughout her life, known only to those closest to her. Elizabeth's childhood was unlike what many imagine when they think of royalty. While she grew up surrounded by royal traditions, her home life was filled with warmth, affection, and simplicity. Her father, Prince Albert, was a gentle and deeply caring man. Despite belonging to one of the world's most powerful royal families, he was naturally shy and struggled with a severe stammer. Public speaking was painful for him, but he never allowed his personal fears to prevent him from fulfilling his duties. Young Elizabeth watched her father carefully. Without realizing it, she was learning one of the greatest lessons of leadership, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to move forward despite it. Her mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, created a loving atmosphere inside the family. She believed discipline should always be balanced with kindness, and she ensured that her daughters experienced a childhood filled with encouragement rather than pressure. In 1930, Elizabeth's younger sister, Princess Margaret, was born. The two girls quickly formed an inseparable bond. They played together, learned together, laughed together, and supported one another through every stage of childhood. Although their personalities were very different, Elizabeth quiet and thoughtful, Margaret lively and outgoing, the sisters shared a close relationship that would last throughout their lives. Unlike most children, Elizabeth never attended a public school. Instead, she received a private education within royal residences. Experienced tutors taught her history, literature, languages, music, religion, and constitutional law. Of all her subjects, constitutional history fascinated her the most. She learned that Britain's monarch ruled not through personal authority, but through constitutional responsibility. A sovereign was expected to remain politically neutral, to advise, to encourage, and to warn, but never to govern according to personal opinion. Those lessons would shape every decision she made decades later. Outside the palace walls, however, Europe was entering one of its darkest periods. The First World War had ended only a few years earlier, yet peace remained fragile. The Great Depression devastated economies across the world. Millions struggled with unemployment and poverty. Political instability spread rapidly across Europe. In Germany, a man named Adolf Hitler rose to power, promising national revival while secretly preparing the nation for war. Across the continent, military strength increased, alliances shifted, and fear quietly replaced hope. Although Elizabeth was still only a young girl, she sensed the growing tension. Newspapers carried alarming headlines. Government officials visited Buckingham Palace more frequently. Conversations between adults became more serious. Britain was preparing for uncertain times. Then, in 1936, an event occurred that no one could have predicted. King George V died. His eldest son became King Edward VIII, and the nation expected a smooth transition. Instead, Britain entered one of the greatest constitutional crises in its history. King Edward VII wished to marry Wallis Simpson, an American woman who had been divorced. At the time, both the British government and the Church of England believed such a marriage was unacceptable for the reigning monarch. The king faced an impossible decision: the crown or the woman he loved. In December 1936, Edward made history. He chose love. In a decision that shocked Britain and the world, he abdicated the throne after reigning for less than a year. His younger brother, Prince Albert, was suddenly called upon to become King George VI. For Albert, the responsibility was overwhelming. He had never expected to rule, and his speech impediment made public appearances deeply challenging. Yet he accepted the crown because he believed duty came before personal comfort. For 10-year-old Elizabeth, that single decision changed everything. Almost overnight, she went from being a young princess with little expectation of ruling to becoming the heir presumptive to the British throne. Her future was no longer uncertain. Every lesson, every tradition, and every responsibility she had been taught suddenly carried a new meaning. Without realizing it, Britain had just witnessed the beginning of one of the most remarkable royal journeys in modern history. For most children, becoming the future ruler of a nation would have been overwhelming. For 10-year-old Princess Elizabeth, it meant something much simpler. It meant preparing herself for a life that no longer belonged entirely to her. From the day her father became King George VI, everything around Elizabeth began to change. Her lessons became more serious. Her daily routine became more disciplined. Every royal appearance was now viewed differently because Britain wasn't looking at an ordinary princess anymore, it was looking at its future queen. Although still a child, Elizabeth understood something that many adults struggled to accept. The crown was not a privilege. It was a responsibility. Every morning brought new lessons in constitutional history, diplomacy, government, and the traditions of the monarchy. She learned how Parliament functioned, why the monarch had to remain politically neutral, and how every action taken by the sovereign carried symbolic meaning. Her tutors often noticed something unusual. Elizabeth rarely complained. She listened more than she spoke. She absorbed information carefully and asked thoughtful questions. The quiet little girl who loved horses was slowly becoming a young woman shaped by discipline and duty. But while Elizabeth prepared for an uncertain future, Europe was moving rapidly toward catastrophe. On 1 September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Just 2 days later, Britain declared war. The Second World War had begun. The peaceful world Elizabeth had known disappeared almost overnight. Air raid sirens became a part of everyday life. Families rushed into underground shelters. Cities prepared for bombing. Children across Britain were evacuated to the countryside for safety. Many believed Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret should leave Britain as well. Some suggested sending them to Canada until the war ended. Their mother immediately rejected the idea. She famously declared that her daughters would never leave without the king would never leave Britain, and she herself would never leave the king. The royal family chose to remain with their people during Britain's darkest hours. It was a decision that strengthened public confidence throughout the war. Even Buckingham Palace was not safe. German bombers repeatedly targeted London. Several bombs struck the palace itself, damaging parts of the royal residence. When Queen Elizabeth, the future Queen Mother, visited the damaged areas, she remarked that she was almost glad the palace had been bombed because it allowed her to look ordinary Londoners in the eye. The royal family was sharing the dangers faced by every citizen. Young Elizabeth watched these events closely. She saw courage not only on battlefields, but inside her own family. As the war intensified, Elizabeth wanted to contribute. She refused to remain simply a protected royal figure. She believed that if millions of young people were serving their country, she should do the same. When she turned 18, she joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, becoming the first female member of the British royal family to serve in the armed forces as an active duty member. There she trained as a driver and mechanic. She learned to repair military vehicles, change engines, and drive heavy trucks. The image of a future queen wearing military overalls with grease-covered hands surprised many people. Yet for Elizabeth, it felt completely natural. Duty demanded participation, not observation. Her military service earned enormous respect throughout Britain. People saw that the future queen was willing to share the sacrifices of ordinary citizens. The war also introduced Elizabeth to another young person whose life would become permanently connected with hers. His name was Philip Mountbatten. Elizabeth had first met Philip several years earlier during family gatherings, but it was during the war that their relationship truly began to grow. Philip served courageously in the Royal Navy. He participated in dangerous naval operations across the Mediterranean and Pacific theaters. Tall, confident, energetic, and adventurous, Philip possessed qualities very different from Elizabeth's calm and reserved personality. Perhaps that was exactly why they connected so deeply. While Philip sailed through dangerous waters, Elizabeth remained in Britain, performing royal duties and supporting wartime morale. Despite the distance between them, they began exchanging letters. Those letters gradually transformed friendship into affection. As Europe continued burning in conflict, a quiet love story was beginning to unfold. Meanwhile, Britain endured unimaginable hardship. Entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath bombings. Food remained rationed. Families waited anxiously for news from the front. Every victory came at an enormous cost. Elizabeth spent countless hours visiting hospitals, meeting injured soldiers, encouraging volunteers, and thanking those who sacrificed everything for their country. These experiences changed her forever. She witnessed grief. She witnessed courage. She witnessed resilience. Most importantly, she learned that leadership was not measured by authority, but by presence. Simply showing up during someone's darkest moment could inspire hope. That lesson would define her reign for decades to come. Finally, after nearly 6 years of devastating conflict, victory arrived. On 8 May 1945, Britain celebrated victory in Europe Day. The streets of London filled with millions of cheering people. Flags waved from every building. Church bells rang across the nation. The war in Europe was over. That evening, King George VI, Queen Elizabeth, Princess Elizabeth, and Princess Margaret appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace before enormous crowds. The celebration was unforgettable. Yet Elizabeth wanted to experience the joy as ordinary citizens did. With permission from her parents, she and Princess Margaret secretly left the palace and joined the celebrating crowds. Walking anonymously through London's streets, surrounded by thousands of people who never realized the future queen stood among them, Elizabeth experienced a rare moment of freedom. Years later, she would describe it as one of the most memorable nights of her entire life. The war had ended. Britain had survived. And Princess Elizabeth had emerged from the conflict no longer as a sheltered child, but as a confident young woman whose understanding of service, sacrifice, and responsibility had been shaped by history itself. She still wasn't queen, but destiny was moving closer with every passing year. The war was over. Britain celebrated victory, but peace did not erase the scars left behind. Cities had been destroyed, thousands of families had lost loved ones, and the once mighty British Empire was beginning to change forever. Princess Elizabeth was now 21 years old. She was no longer simply the king's daughter. She had become a symbol of hope for a nation rebuilding itself. On 21 April 1947, during a royal tour of South Africa, Elizabeth delivered a speech that would become one of the defining moments of her entire life. Standing before a microphone on her 21st birthday, she made a promise that millions would never forget. She declared, "I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong." At the time, few people understood the weight of those words. But history would later prove that she meant every single one of them. Her promise was not written by destiny. It was chosen by character. As the young princess returned to Britain, another important chapter of her life was quietly unfolding. Her relationship with Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten had grown stronger over the years. Despite spending long periods apart because of Philip's naval service, the two remained deeply connected through letters. Philip brought energy, humor, confidence, and adventure into Elizabeth's carefully structured royal life. He challenged her. He made her laugh. Most importantly, he treated her as Elizabeth, not simply as the future queen. Not everyone supported the relationship. Philip had been born into the Greek and Danish royal families, but Europe after World War II remained politically sensitive. Some members of the British establishment questioned whether he was the right choice. Others worried about his foreign background. But Elizabeth had already made up her mind. For perhaps the first and only time in her life, she placed her heart before public opinion. In July 1947, Buckingham Palace officially announced their engagement. Before the wedding could take place, Philip made several important sacrifices. He became a British citizen. He gave up his Greek and Danish royal titles. He adopted the surname Mountbatten. Only then did King George VI grant him the title Duke of Edinburgh. On 20 November 1947, Westminster Abbey became the center of the world. Nearly 2,000 guests filled the historic church. Millions more listened on the radio. Britain was still recovering from war. Food rationing continued. Even Princess Elizabeth used ration coupons to help pay for the material used in her wedding dress. It was a reminder that even the royal family shared many of the hardships experienced by ordinary citizens. As Elizabeth walked slowly through Westminster Abbey, wearing an elegant ivory gown decorated with thousands of pearls and crystals, the nation witnessed not only a royal wedding, but the beginning of one of the most famous marriages in modern history. For many exhausted by years of war, the celebration represented hope. A brighter future finally seemed possible. Following the ceremony, Elizabeth and Philip began married life together. Although they belonged to one of the world's most famous families, they initially enjoyed moments of surprising normality. When Philip continued serving in the Royal Navy, the couple spent time living in Malta. Years later, Elizabeth would describe Malta as one of the happiest periods of her life. For perhaps the last time, she experienced something close to an ordinary marriage. She could shop, attend social gatherings, and enjoy evenings with her husband without the overwhelming responsibilities that awaited her. But history was once again preparing to change everything. On 14 November 1948, Elizabeth gave birth to her first child, a son. He was named Charles Philip Arthur George. The arrival of the future king brought enormous joy throughout Britain. 2 years later, on 15 August 1950, the family welcomed their second child, a daughter. She was named Princess Anne. Elizabeth embraced motherhood with the same sense of dedication that guided every other part of her life. Despite countless royal duties, she remained deeply involved in her children's upbringing whenever possible. Yet behind the scenes, another concern was growing. King George VI's health had begun to decline. Years of stress during the Second World War, combined with heavy smoking, had severely damaged his health. Doctors diagnosed serious lung problems. Although the palace released reassuring statements, those closest to the king understood that he was becoming increasingly weak. As his condition worsened, Princess Elizabeth quietly assumed more royal responsibilities. She represented the king at important ceremonies. She met foreign leaders. She undertook overseas tour on behalf of the crown. Every assignment became another step toward the destiny she had never expected. In early 1952, Elizabeth and Philip embarked on a royal tour representing the king. Their journey included visits to Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. The trip was meant to demonstrate the strength of the monarchy across the Commonwealth. Neither of them knew that their lives were about to change forever. On the evening of 5 February 1952, they arrived at a remote lodge in Kenya. The atmosphere was peaceful. The following morning, while Elizabeth was still in Africa, devastating news arrived. King George VI had died peacefully in his sleep at Sandringham House. He was only 56 years old. In a single moment, everything changed. The young woman who had left Britain as a princess would return home as Queen Elizabeth II. She was only 25 years old. There was no ceremony, no rehearsal, no time to prepare. The crown had passed instantly. Duty had called, and Elizabeth answered. The crown had found its new bearer. There was no celebration, no moment to pause, no chance to grieve as an ordinary daughter. At just 25 years old, Elizabeth had lost her father, and in the very same instant, she had become Queen Elizabeth II. When the news reached her in Kenya, witnesses later described a profound silence. The young princess, who had begun the day expecting another engagement on a royal tour, now faced the greatest responsibility of her life. Prince Philip quietly walked beside her. There were no cameras capturing her first reaction. No dramatic speeches. Only the weight of history settling upon her shoulders. The royal tour ended immediately. Elizabeth boarded a plane back to Britain, not as Princess Elizabeth, but as the Queen. As her aircraft landed in London, the world was no longer looking at a young royal. It was looking at the new sovereign of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. Black flags flew over government buildings. Church bells echoed across the country. Millions mourned King George VI. Yet amid the sorrow, Britain also looked toward its new queen. She understood that personal grief could not delay public duty. Within hours, she began meeting government officials, reviewing state documents, and preparing for the responsibilities that would define the rest of her life. One of her first important decisions was deeply symbolic. Many expected the royal house to adopt Prince Philip's family name, Mountbatten. Instead, Elizabeth announced that the monarchy would continue as the House of Windsor, preserving the dynasty established during her grandfather's reign. It was a decision rooted in continuity and stability, qualities that would become the hallmark of her rule. In the months that followed, preparations began for one of the grandest royal ceremonies in modern history. The coronation. On 2 June 1953, Westminster Abbey became the stage for an event unlike any the world had seen. More than 8,000 guests filled the ancient church. Kings, queens, presidents, prime ministers, military leaders, and religious figures gathered beneath its towering arches. Outside, despite heavy rain, hundreds of thousands of people lined the streets of London. For the first time in history, the coronation was broadcast on television. Many government officials had opposed the idea. They believed the sacred ceremony should remain unseen by the public. Elizabeth disagreed. She believed the monarchy must adapt to a changing world. As a result, millions of families purchased television sets simply to witness the historic event. Across Britain and across the Commonwealth, people crowded into homes, village halls, cafes, and shop windows to watch history unfold together. It became one of the most watched broadcasts ever recorded at that time. Dressed in magnificent ceremonial robes, Elizabeth slowly walked through Westminster Abbey, carrying not only royal tradition, but the hopes of an entire nation. During the ceremony, she swore to govern according to law, protect justice, and faithfully serve her people. Then came the defining moment. The crown of St. Edward, weighing more than 2 kilograms and crafted centuries earlier, was gently placed upon her head. The Archbishop proclaimed, "God save the Queen." Inside the abbey, trumpets sounded. Outside, artillery guns fired royal salutes. Across the nation, church bells rang in celebration. At just 27 years old, Elizabeth II had officially become queen. But while the world admired the splendor of the ceremony, few understood the personal sacrifices that lay ahead. From that day forward, every decision she made, every journey she took, every speech she delivered, and every holiday she planned would be shaped by one unchanging principle. Duty came first. Her private life would forever belong to history. Her reign had only just begun. And no one, not even Elizabeth herself, could have imagined that it would last for more than 7 decades, becoming the longest reign in British history and one of the most extraordinary chapters ever written in the story of the modern world. The moment the crown touched Elizabeth's head, Britain entered a new era. It was no longer the age of King George VI. It had become the Elizabethan age. No monarch before her had inherited a world changing so rapidly. The British Empire, once stretching across continents, was beginning to dissolve. Nations that had long been part of the empire sought independence, and the map of the world was being redrawn. Many believed the monarchy itself would gradually lose its relevance. Elizabeth believed otherwise. She understood that survival did not depend on resisting change. It depended on adapting to it. Rather than trying to preserve the empire exactly as it had been, she supported its transformation into the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary family of independent countries connected by history, cooperation, and shared values. Over the years, she would visit almost every corner of the Commonwealth, becoming one of the most traveled heads of state in history. Wherever she went, enormous crowds gathered. Some came to see their queen. Others came simply to witness history. Each handshake, every speech, and every state visit strengthened relationships that politics alone could never build. Meanwhile, life inside Buckingham Palace was far from quiet. In 1960, Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip welcomed their third child, Prince Andrew. 4 years later, in 1964, their youngest son, Prince Edward, was born. For the first time in more than a century, a reigning British monarch had given birth while on the throne. Balancing motherhood with the responsibilities of a global monarch was never easy. Every week, she received official government papers in the famous red dispatch boxes. Thousands of state documents passed through her hands each year. Every Tuesday evening, she met privately with the British Prime Minister. These meetings remained completely confidential. Over the course of her reign, she worked with 15 British Prime Ministers, from Winston Churchill to Liz Truss. Each brought different political beliefs. Elizabeth brought the same calm neutrality. She never publicly supported political parties. She never campaigned. She believed the monarch should stand above politics, serving as a symbol of unity for every citizen. That discipline earned respect across the political spectrum. As the decades passed, the world transformed at breathtaking speed. Television entered millions of homes. Humans landed on the moon. The Cold War divided East and West. The Berlin Wall rose and later fell. The Internet connected the globe. Through every historic moment, Queen Elizabeth II remained a constant presence. One of her greatest strengths was consistency. Governments changed. Prime ministers came and went. World leaders rose and fell. Yet the Queen remained. She rarely allowed emotion to dominate public appearances. Her speeches were measured. Her expressions were composed. Her commitment never seemed to waver. People often described her as reserved. Those closest to her described something different. They spoke of her dry sense of humor, her sharp memory, and her remarkable ability to make visitors feel comfortable. Away from official ceremonies, she found peace with her beloved corgis, her horses, and long walks in the countryside. Horse racing became one of her greatest passions. She could remember bloodlines, racing histories, and breeding records with astonishing accuracy. Despite wearing one of the world's most famous crowns, she found happiness in remarkably ordinary moments. Yet no reign, no matter how remarkable, is without hardship. The decades ahead would test her leadership in ways no ceremony could prepare her for. Family crises, public criticism, political upheaval, national tragedies, and moments that would force the Queen to prove that true leadership is measured not only in times of celebration, but in moments of sorrow. By the early 1970s, Queen Elizabeth II had become one of the most recognized faces on Earth. Wherever she traveled, enormous crowds gathered hours before her arrival. Streets filled with waving flags, children sat on their parents' shoulders hopping for a glimpse, and cameras from around the world captured every step she took. But while the Queen's popularity remained strong, the world around her was becoming increasingly complicated. Britain faced economic difficulties. Inflation soared. Workers went on strike. Political tensions grew, and many people began questioning whether the monarchy still had a place in a modern democracy. Elizabeth never answered those questions with speeches. Instead, she answered them with service. Week after week, year after year, she continued carrying out hundreds of official engagements, believing that consistency would speak louder than words. During these decades, she became one of history's greatest diplomatic figures. She welcomed presidents, kings, queens, prime ministers, and religious leaders from every continent. Some were close allies. Others represented countries with very different political systems. Regardless of their backgrounds, every visitor received the same courtesy, respect, and professionalism. Her ability to remain politically neutral became one of the monarchy's greatest strengths. Governments changed. Policies changed. The Queen remained constant. Among the world leaders she met were figures who shaped modern history. She met John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Nelson Mandela, Mikhail Gorbachev, Pope John Paul II, and countless others. Each meeting represented more than ceremony. It symbolized continuity in a rapidly changing world. One friendship stood out in particular. After spending 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela emerged as the leader who would guide South Africa away from apartheid. When he met Queen Elizabeth II, the two developed a relationship built on deep mutual respect. Mandela affectionately called her Elizabeth, Very few people in the world addressed the Queen so personally. She appreciated his honesty, humility, and extraordinary capacity for forgiveness. Their friendship became one of the most admired relationships between two global leaders. As the years passed, the Queen witnessed history unfold before her eyes. She watched astronauts walk on the moon. She saw the construction and later the fall of the Berlin Wall. She observed the collapse of the Soviet Union. She witnessed the birth of the internet, mobile phones, and the digital age. The world transformed faster than anyone could have imagined. Yet inside Buckingham Palace, one tradition never changed. Every Tuesday evening, the Prime Minister arrived for a private audience with the Queen. There were no advisors, no cameras, no recordings, only two people discussing the affairs of the nation. Those conversations remained confidential for her entire life. Not once did she reveal what was said. That extraordinary discretion earned the trust of every prime minister who served under her reign. But while the Queen excelled in public duty, challenges were quietly growing within her own family. The marriages of her children began attracting intense media attention. Every disagreement became newspaper headlines. Every private struggle became public discussion. The royal family was no longer protected from constant media coverage. Television had changed everything. For the first time, millions could watch royal lives unfold in real time. Then came 1992, a year the Queen herself would later describe in unforgettable words. 3 of her children's marriages broke down. A devastating fire severely damaged Windsor Castle, one of the monarchy's oldest and most treasured homes. Public criticism intensified. Confidence in the royal family reached one of its lowest points. During a speech marking the 40th anniversary of her accession, the Queen reflected on that difficult year. She called it her annus horribilis, Latin for a horrible year. It was an unusually personal admission from a monarch known for emotional restraint. Behind the calm expression stood a mother watching her family struggle under relentless public pressure. For perhaps the first time, people saw not only a queen, but a woman carrying extraordinary personal burdens while continuing to fulfill every public duty. Yet an even greater test was still to come. One event would shake the monarchy to its core and change Queen Elizabeth II's reign forever. The early hours of 31 August 1997 changed the British monarchy forever. News spread rapidly across the world. Diana, Princess of Wales, had died in a car crash in Paris. The shock was immediate. Millions of people refused to believe it. Outside Buckingham Palace, flowers began appearing by the hundreds, then by the thousands, then by the millions. It became one of the largest public displays of grief in modern history. At that moment, Queen Elizabeth II was staying at Balmoral Castle in Scotland with her grandchildren, Prince William and Prince Harry. Her first instinct was not to think as a monarch. It was to think as a grandmother. She wanted to protect 2 young boys who had just lost their mother. For several days, the Queen remained at Balmoral, shielding them from the cameras and the overwhelming attention of the world. But many people misunderstood her silence. Newspapers criticized the royal family. Some believed the monarchy had become distant from the emotions of the public. Recognizing the nation's grief, Queen Elizabeth returned to London. On 5 September 1997, she delivered a rare live television address. Speaking directly to the British people, she honored Diana's compassion, kindness, and devotion to her sons. Her words were calm, heartfelt, and sincere. For many, the speech marked an important turning point. It reminded the nation that behind the crown stood a family experiencing loss, just like millions of others. As the years passed, Queen Elizabeth continued adapting the monarchy to a rapidly changing world. She embraced modern communication while preserving centuries-old traditions. She welcomed visitors from every continent. She continued meeting weekly with prime ministers, carrying out hundreds of engagements every year, even well into her 80s and 90s. Then, in 2012, Britain celebrated one of the greatest milestones in royal history, the Diamond Jubilee, marking 60 years on the throne. Across the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, millions gathered for parades, concerts, Thanksgiving services, and street celebrations. It was a tribute not only to a queen, but to a lifetime of unwavering service. A decade later came an even more extraordinary achievement. In 2022, Queen Elizabeth II celebrated her Platinum Jubilee, the first British monarch ever to reach 70 years on the throne. The celebrations stretched across 4 unforgettable days. From military parades and concerts to flypasts and community events, the nation honored a reign unlike any before it. Though age had begun to limit her public appearances, her smile remained unmistakable. The crowds knew they were witnessing history. But behind the celebrations, another quiet struggle was unfolding. On 9 April 2021, Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, her husband of more than 73 years, passed away at the age of 99. For the first time in decades, the Queen faced royal duties without the man who had stood beside her through every triumph and every hardship. Images of her sitting alone at Philip's funeral during the COVID-19 restrictions touched hearts around the world. The woman who had comforted nations for generations was now grieving in silence. Yet she continued her work. Even in her final months, Queen Elizabeth remained committed to duty. On 6 September 2022, just 2 days before her death, she welcomed Britain's new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, at Balmoral Castle. Although she appeared physically frail, she fulfilled her constitutional responsibility one last time. It would become the final official photograph of her remarkable reign. Then, on 8 September 2022, the announcement the world had long feared finally arrived. The Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon. She was 96 years old. Within minutes, church bells rang across Britain. Flags were lowered to half-mast. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace in complete silence. Around the world, presidents, kings, queens, prime ministers, and ordinary citizens paid tribute to a woman whose reign had defined an era. Her funeral on 19 September 2022 became one of the most watched events in television history. World leaders traveled to London. Thousands lined the streets through the night. Millions more watched from every corner of the globe. As her coffin, draped in the royal standard and crowned with the imperial state crown, made its final journey, Britain said goodbye to a monarch who had kept the promise she made as a young princess in 1947, to devote her whole life to the service of her people. And she did. For more than 70 years, Queen Elizabeth II served with discipline, dignity, and consistency. She worked with 15 British prime ministers, met countless world leaders, witnessed extraordinary historical change, and remained a symbol of continuity through decades of uncertainty. Few people in history have lived through so many defining moments. Fewer still have shaped them so quietly. Queen Elizabeth II's greatest legacy was not power. It was service. Not politics, but stability. Not fame, but duty. She was born a princess who was never expected to rule. She became the longest-reigning monarch in British history. And when her journey finally came to an end, she left behind more than a crown. She left behind a legacy that will be remembered for generations. History will always remember Queen Elizabeth II, not simply as a queen, but as a woman who kept her promise. The end.